History's deadliest arguments sometimes began with pastries, potatoes, and stolen buckets, and those are only the appetizers. Keep watching, because these conflicts become so ridiculous that even the official explanations sound like rejected comedy sketches. 1. The Pig War. One dead pig, two armed empires. In 1859, the United States and Britain nearly went to war because a pig developed an expensive taste for potatoes. San Juan Island, between present-day Washington State and Vancouver Island, was claimed by both countries because an 1846 treaty had described the border with the precision of someone giving directions after 3 drinks. American farmer Lyman Cutler discovered a pig eating from his garden. The animal belonged to Charles Griffin, who worked for the British Hudson's Bay Company. After repeated visits from the four-legged vegetable inspector, Cutler shot it. A neighborhood dispute quickly became an international crisis. American soldiers arrived. Britain sent warships. At one point, hundreds of troops and several naval vessels were facing each other over an animal whose entire military strategy had been find potato, eat potato. Fortunately, cooler heads refused to open fire. The two sides eventually occupied separate camps while diplomats handled the dispute. No humans were killed. The pig remained the only casualty, making it history's least successful soldier and most influential lunch guest. 2. The Pastry War. France sends a navy over a bakery bill. In the 1830s, a French pastry cook living near Mexico City claimed that Mexican officers had damaged and looted his shop during a period of unrest. He reportedly demanded compensation. By itself, this should have produced paperwork, arguments, and perhaps a strongly worded letter smelling faintly of butter. Instead, it helped produce a war. The pastry chef's complaint became the most famous of several financial claims made by French citizens against Mexico. France eventually demanded 600,000 pesos, far more than the baker's original loss, and when Mexico refused, French warships blockaded Gulf ports in 1838. They later attacked the fortress of San Juan de Ulua near Veracruz. So, to be clear, an argument involving damaged pastries escalated into naval bombardment. It was international diplomacy conducted like an angry customer demanding to speak with the manager, except the customer had cannons. Britain eventually helped negotiate peace in 1839, and Mexico agreed to pay. The conflict became known as the Pastry War, proving that France has always taken baked goods with a level of seriousness normally reserved for national borders and personal insults. 3. The War of the Bucket, medieval Italy's most overqualified plumbing dispute. In 1325, the Italian city-states of Bologna and Modena fought the Battle of Zappolino during a much larger political rivalry. Bologna supported the papal-aligned Guelph faction, while Modena supported the imperial Ghibellines. In other words, the real causes involved territory, power, and generations of hostility, the standard medieval package. But history remembered a bucket. According to the famous story, Modenese soldiers stole a wooden bucket from a well in Bologna and carried it home as a trophy. Bologna supposedly demanded its return. Modena refused because apparently medieval diplomacy had no setting between absolutely not and prepare the cavalry. The bucket did not truly create the conflict. Fighting had already grown from the city's deeper rivalry. However, it became the perfect symbol of the war because nothing summarizes human pride better than thousands of armed men risking death while a wooden container waits safely at home. Modena won the Battle of Zappolino, and a bucket traditionally associated with the episode is still displayed in Modena. That means the victors did not merely win the battle, they also kept the world's most aggressively defended piece of household equipment. 4. The War of Jenkins Ear. One severed ear, thousands of casualties. Imagine a war whose most famous symbol could fit inside a small glass jar. That is exactly what happened in 1739, when Britain declared war on Spain after years of growing tension over trade in the Caribbean. The conflict had deep economic and political causes, but the event that captured everyone's imagination involved one unfortunate merchant captain named Robert Jenkins. Several years earlier, Jenkins claimed that Spanish coast guards had boarded his ship, accused him of smuggling, and cut off one of his ears. According to the famous story, the Spanish officer handed it back and told him to show it to his king. Whether Jenkins actually preserved the ear in a jar remains debated by historians, but in 1738 he testified before the British Parliament, displaying the injury that became a powerful piece of anti-Spanish propaganda. Newspapers loved the story, politicians repeated it, public outrage exploded. Soon, Britain was at war with Spain, even though the real dispute centered on trade rights and imperial rivalry. The conflict eventually merged into the much larger War of the Austrian Succession, costing thousands of lives across Europe and the Americas. It's a remarkable reminder that complicated geopolitical disputes often get remembered by the smallest and strangest detail imaginable. 5. The Football War. When a soccer match became the final spark. At first glance, it sounds impossible. Two countries don't go to war because of a soccer game, and technically they didn't. But in 1969, World Cup qualifying matches between El Salvador and Honduras became the spark that ignited years of growing political and social tensions. Relations between the neighboring countries had already become dangerously strained. Thousands of Salvadorans had migrated into Honduras, creating disputes over land ownership and immigration. Economic problems, land reform, and rising nationalism pushed both governments toward confrontation long before anyone kicked a ball onto the field. Then came the World Cup qualifiers. The matches were emotional, hostile, and surrounded by violence between fans. Newspapers on both sides inflamed public anger, turning a sporting rivalry into a national obsession. Just weeks after the final match, El Salvador launched military attacks against Honduras on July 14, 1969. The fighting lasted only about 100 hours before the Organization of American States negotiated a ceasefire, which is why it's also known as the 100 Hours War. The soccer games didn't cause the conflict, but they provided the emotional match that lit an already overflowing barrel of gunpowder. Sometimes history remembers the spark more vividly than the explosives waiting underneath. 6. The War of the Stray Dog. A border incident nobody could have predicted. In 1925, Greece and Bulgaria found themselves on the edge of another Balkan conflict because of an event so bizarre it almost sounds like a joke. A Greek soldier stationed near the border reportedly chased his dog after it wandered across the frontier. As he crossed into Bulgarian territory, Bulgarian guards opened fire, killing the soldier. Whether the dog actually crossed first or whether other border tensions were already escalating has been debated by historians. But one thing is certain, the shooting triggered a major diplomatic crisis. Greece accused Bulgaria of provoking the attack and quickly sent troops across the border. Fighting broke out in several villages, forcing civilians to flee while both governments blamed each other. For a few days, Europe watched nervously as another Balkan war seemed ready to explode. Fortunately, the recently created League of Nations intervened before the conflict could grow larger. The organization ordered both sides to stop fighting, investigate the incident, and eventually ruled that Greece should withdraw its forces and pay compensation to Bulgaria. The conflict became known as the War of the Stray Dog, even though the real issues involved unstable borders and lingering hostility after earlier Balkan wars. Still, it's difficult to ignore the strange image at the center of the story. One runaway dog accidentally becoming part of international military history. 7. The War of the Oaken Bucket, a stolen bucket that became a local legend. Few historical stories prove that civic pride can outlive common sense, quite like the famous tale of the Oaken Bucket. During the long rivalry between the Italian cities of Modena and Bologna, soldiers from Modena carried away a wooden bucket from a public well in Bologna after their victory at the Battle of Zappolino in 1325. Now, historians agree that the battle itself wasn't fought because of the bucket. The cities had spent decades competing over territory, political alliances, and regional influence. The fighting would have happened regardless. But the stolen bucket quickly became the ultimate symbol of humiliation. Instead of returning it, Modena proudly displayed the bucket as a trophy. Bologna viewed it as an insult that perfectly captured their defeat. Over time, the bucket itself became more famous than many of the political arguments that actually caused the conflict. The original wooden bucket, or at least one traditionally associated with the event, can still be seen in Modena today. It has survived centuries of wars, governments, and changing borders. Most museum pieces celebrate artistic genius or scientific discovery. This one celebrates medieval Italians, proving that if you're determined enough, even basic household equipment can become a permanent national flex. 8. The Kettle War, the battle that produced almost no battle. In 1784, the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II became involved in one of Europe's most wonderfully anticlimactic military disputes. Joseph wanted free navigation on the Scheldt River, which had long been controlled by the Dutch, and tensions gradually escalated into military action. Then came the most famous moment of the conflict. An Austrian ship attempted to sail along the river toward Antwerp. Dutch forces responded by firing a single cannonball. Instead of sinking the vessel or causing major casualties, the shot reportedly struck nothing more significant than a soup kettle hanging on board. The damaged cookware became the conflict's lasting symbol. Because virtually no one was killed, the confrontation earned the nickname the Kettle War. After months of diplomatic negotiations, the dispute ended with the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1785. The Dutch maintained control over the river, while Austria received financial compensation. Looking back, it's hard not to appreciate the sheer contrast. European powers mobilized armies, threatened invasion, and argued over strategic waterways. Yet the most memorable casualty was dinner. History is full of legendary battles, but only one is remembered because somebody's cookware had a very unfortunate day. 9. The War of the Three Sanchos, when three kings shared the same name. If medieval diplomacy wasn't confusing enough, 1067 delivered a political mess that sounds like someone forgot to label the family tree. Three neighboring rulers on the Iberian Peninsula were all named Sancho. Sancho II ruled Castile, Sancho IV ruled Navarre, and Sancho Ramirez ruled Aragon. To historians, the conflict is often called the War of the Three Sanchos, not because the name caused the fighting, but because trying to explain who invaded whom without repeating Sancho every 5 seconds is nearly impossible. The real issue was land. Borders in northern Spain shifted constantly, and every king believed his neighbors owned territory that rightfully belonged to him. Alliances changed almost weekly, relatives betrayed one another, and medieval politics looked more like an extended family argument than organized statecraft. The war ended with Castile expanding its territory, while Navarre lost several important frontier towns. Ironically, centuries later, people are far more likely to remember the conflict because every major ruler answered to exactly the same name. Imagine reading battlefield reports where every sentence begins with, "Sancho attacked Sancho while Sancho negotiated with Sancho." Medieval scribes deserved hazard pay. 10. The War of the Bavarian Succession. Europe fights over an empty inheritance. When the ruler of Bavaria died in 1777 without children, Europe reacted the way wealthy relatives sometimes do when someone leaves behind valuable property. Everyone suddenly discovered they had an opinion about inheritance. Austria wanted to absorb large parts of Bavaria. Prussia strongly disagreed. Other German states worried the balance of power would collapse if Austria became too strong. The result was the War of the Bavarian Succession, fought between 1778 and 1779. Despite involving tens of thousands of soldiers, the campaign became famous for something other than spectacular battles. Neither army seemed particularly interested in fighting major engagements. Instead, soldiers spent much of their time marching through forests, raiding farms, and desperately searching for food. Supplies ran so low that both sides frequently stole potatoes from local fields simply to survive. That earned the conflict its unforgettable nickname, the Potato War. It's difficult to imagine Europe's greatest military powers spending months chasing sacks of vegetables instead of victories, but that's exactly what happened. More soldiers died from disease and hunger than from combat. The Treaty of Teschen eventually ended the dispute, and Austria gained only modest territory. After all that marching, Europe's biggest military achievement turned out to be discovering every potato field in Central Europe. 11. The Chincha Islands War. Bird droppings become international business. Most people don't expect bird droppings to trigger an international conflict. Then again, most people have never tried to build an economy around fertilizer. During the mid-1800s, the Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru contained enormous deposits of guano, bird droppings that had become one of the world's most valuable fertilizers. Before modern chemical fertilizers existed, guano was worth a fortune because it dramatically improved crop yields. Spain, hoping to regain influence in South America decades after losing most of its colonies, occupied the islands in 1864. Peru refused to accept the occupation, and tensions quickly spread across the Pacific coast. Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador eventually became involved against Spain. The fighting included naval battles and the bombardment of important ports, making the conflict far more serious than its unusual nickname suggests. Yet history still remembers that one of the world's strangest strategic resources sat at the center of it all. It's oddly humbling to realize that governments once argued over mountains of bird waste with the same determination later generations would reserve for oil fields. One century values petroleum, another values seabird leftovers. History has always been surprisingly flexible about what counts as treasure. 12. The First Cod War. Fish become foreign policy. Ask most people what starts wars, and they'll probably say oil, gold, or territory. Few would answer cod. In the 1950s, Iceland decided to expand its exclusive fishing zone from 4 nautical miles to 12. Britain objected because British fishing fleets had relied on those waters for generations. Iceland, meanwhile, argued that protecting its fish stocks was essential for the country's survival. For a nation whose economy depended heavily on fishing, this wasn't just about seafood, it was about the future. The disagreement became known as the First Cod War. Despite the dramatic name, there were no formal declarations of war and almost no traditional battles. Instead, Icelandic Coast Guard vessels confronted British fishing boats, while Royal Navy ships escorted the trawlers. Diplomats argued, ships maneuvered aggressively, fishing nets were seized, tempers flared. Eventually, Britain accepted Iceland's expanded fishing limits, but the dispute didn't end there. 2 more Cod Wars followed during the next 2 decades as Iceland extended its fishing zone even farther. It's difficult not to smile at the idea of naval standoffs over fish. Yet those cod represented jobs, food, and national independence. Sometimes the world's most ordinary dinner becomes international strategy. 13. The Second Cod War, the Battle of the Fishing Nets. By the early 1970s, Iceland wasn't finished protecting its fishing grounds. In 1972, the country expanded its exclusive fishing zone again, this time to 50 nautical miles. Britain protested once more, insisting its fishing fleets had historic rights in the area. Unlike many international disputes, this one involved remarkably little gunfire but an impressive amount of creative engineering. Icelandic patrol ships began using special cable cutters designed to slice through the trawl wires of British fishing boats. Imagine spending thousands of dollars preparing for a fishing trip only to have another ship quietly arrive and cut your nets loose. British naval vessels escorted the trawlers, leading to tense confrontations at sea. Ships occasionally collided during dangerous maneuvering, but both governments carefully avoided escalating into full-scale military conflict. Eventually, negotiations produced another agreement that favored Iceland. Looking back, it's hard not to admire Iceland's determination. This tiny nation repeatedly stood up to one of the world's largest naval powers, and won, not through overwhelming military force, but through persistence, diplomacy, and a willingness to treat fishing nets like strategic military targets. 14. The Third Cod War, when NATO nearly had a seafood crisis. If the previous Cod Wars weren't unusual enough, the final round became even stranger because both countries belonged to NATO. In 1975, Iceland extended its fishing limit once again, this time to 200 nautical miles. Britain refused to recognize the new boundary, sending naval vessels to protect its trawlers. For months, Icelandic patrol boats and Royal Navy frigates played an increasingly dangerous game of cat and mouse. Ships deliberately bumped into one another. Fishing equipment was cut loose. Captains tested each other's patience while diplomats worked overtime behind the scenes. The stakes were surprisingly high. Iceland threatened to close the important NATO base at Keflavik if its demands weren't respected. Suddenly, an argument over fish carried Cold War implications that reached far beyond the North Atlantic. Britain eventually accepted Iceland's new fishing zone. It's one of history's greatest examples of a small nation using diplomacy, geography, and sheer determination to outmaneuver a much larger opponent. Somewhere beneath all the political speeches, however, millions of cod probably continued swimming around completely unaware that they had become strategic assets. 15. The Toledo War, Ohio and Michigan. Nearly came to blows over a swamp today, Toledo is simply another American city. In the 1830s, it almost became the reason 2 U.S. governments started shooting at each other. Both the Michigan Territory and the state of Ohio claimed ownership of a narrow strip of land containing Toledo. The disagreement stemmed from conflicting maps and poorly defined state boundaries dating back decades. Neither side wanted to compromise. Militias gathered near the border. Officials arrested rival surveyors. Local politicians delivered fiery speeches that made the situation sound far more dramatic than the muddy landscape actually looked. Remarkably, almost nobody was seriously injured. The conflict's only widely reported casualty was a Michigan sheriff who was slightly wounded during an arrest attempt. Congress eventually settled the dispute in 1836. Ohio kept Toledo, while Michigan received the Upper Peninsula as compensation. At the time, many Michiganders considered that a terrible deal because the Upper Peninsula seemed like an isolated wilderness. Then, enormous deposits of copper and iron were discovered there. History has a wonderful sense of irony. Michigan spent years complaining about losing a swamp before accidentally receiving one of the richest mineral regions in the United States. 16. The Aroostook War, Lumberjacks. Prepare for battle. Most wars feature cavalry, artillery, and dramatic battlefield charges. The Aroostook War of 1838 to 1839 mostly featured lumberjacks arguing over trees. The United States and Britain disagreed about the border between Maine and New Brunswick after the Treaty of Paris left parts of the frontier frustratingly vague. Both sides claimed valuable forests, and timber was becoming increasingly important for construction and shipbuilding. Soon, local authorities began arresting rival loggers. Militias assembled, soldiers marched into snowy forests where they spent more time freezing than fighting. Remarkably, no actual battle between American and British forces ever occurred. Instead, diplomats eventually negotiated the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842, finally settling the border dispute. Looking back, the conflict resembles an enormous misunderstanding that somehow attracted thousands of armed men. It's one of those rare military crises where paperwork ultimately proved more effective than muskets. Somewhere deep in the forests of Maine, countless pine trees unknowingly survived, becoming the reason two English-speaking nations nearly fought another war. 17. The War of the Orange Tree. A piece of fruit becomes royal insult. Some diplomatic gestures involve expensive gifts or carefully written treaties. In 1801, one involved a branch from an orange tree. France wanted Portugal to end its alliance with Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. Spain joined France in pressuring its neighbor, eventually invading Portuguese territory. During the campaign, Spanish commander Manuel Godoy captured the town of Elvas. Feeling particularly pleased with himself, he picked a few oranges from a nearby tree and sent them to Queen Maria Luisa of Spain, boasting that he would soon conquer Lisbon as easily. That simple gift became so famous that the conflict earned the nickname the War of the Orange Tree. Ironically, Godoy's confidence proved far greater than his military success. Portugal eventually surrendered some territory under the Treaty of Badajoz, but the victory was nowhere near as complete as he had promised. History loves symbols. Sometimes they're flags, sometimes they're crowns. Occasionally, they're citrus fruit carried home by a general who may have celebrated just a little too early. 18. The Lobster War. Tiny crustaceans, big tempers. In the 1960s, France and Brazil found themselves arguing over one of the ocean's most expensive delicacies, lobsters. French fishing boats operated off Brazil's northeastern coast, catching lobsters that Brazil insisted belonged to its continental shelf. France disagreed, arguing that lobsters swam through open water and therefore couldn't be claimed by Brazil alone. The legal debate quickly became wonderfully absurd. Brazilian officials argued that lobsters crawl along the seabed, making them part of Brazil's natural resources. French representatives responded that lobsters also swim, meaning they should be treated like fish. Naval vessels from both countries appeared in the disputed waters, and for a time the situation looked surprisingly serious. Eventually, diplomacy prevailed, and agreements ended the confrontation without shots being fired. Few international legal arguments have ever depended so heavily on whether a lobster should officially be described as walking or swimming. Somewhere, marine biologists unexpectedly became important witnesses in foreign policy. 19. The Beaver Wars. Fur was worth more than gold. Today, beavers are mostly known for building dams and looking surprisingly busy. During the 17th century, they helped reshape North America. European demand for beaver pelts exploded because felt hats had become fashionable across the continent. The fur trade generated enormous profits, and indigenous nations competed to control access to hunting territories and trade routes. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, expanded aggressively into neighboring regions during what became known as the Beaver Wars. European colonial powers also became involved, supplying weapons and forming shifting alliances that transformed commercial competition into decades of conflict. Although the name sounds almost humorous today, the consequences were anything but. Entire communities were displaced, trade networks changed dramatically, and the balance of power across northeastern North America shifted for generations. The irony remains striking. Fashion trends in European cities helped fuel warfare thousands of miles away. It's one of history's earliest reminders that what people wear in one continent can profoundly change lives in another. 20. The Cinnamon War. When two tiny islands created a giant argument. In the 17th century, cinnamon ranked among the world's most valuable spices. Before refrigeration and modern food preservation, spices weren't just luxury items, they were serious business. The Dutch and Portuguese competed fiercely for control of the spice trade across Asia, particularly in present-day Sri Lanka and the Indonesian archipelago. Although historians don't usually recognize a single official cinnamon war, several armed conflicts between the Dutch East India Company and Portugal were driven largely by competition over cinnamon and other spices. Control of production meant enormous wealth. Whoever controlled the spice routes could influence markets across Europe. It's almost impossible today to imagine governments risking fleets and fortresses over something most people casually sprinkle onto oatmeal. Yet, in the 17th century, cinnamon was sometimes worth more than its weight in silver. History has an incredible ability to change perspective. One era treats spices like strategic weapons. Another keeps them next to the coffee filters. 21. The War of the Golden Stool. A chair nobody was allowed to sit on. In 1900, British colonial officials in West Africa made a remarkable mistake. They misunderstood the meaning of one very important chair. The Golden Stool of the Ashanti people was never an ordinary throne. According to Ashanti tradition, it represented the spirit and unity of the entire nation. No king actually sat on it because it was considered sacred. British Governor Sir Frederick Hodgson failed to appreciate that distinction. He publicly demanded to sit on the Golden Stool, believing it symbolized political authority that Britain now controlled. To the Ashanti, the request was deeply offensive. The result was an armed uprising known as the War of the Golden Stool. Ashanti forces surrounded the British fort at Kumasi for months before reinforcements eventually relieved the garrison. Britain ultimately suppressed the rebellion, but the Golden Stool itself was never captured during the conflict. It's one of history's clearest examples of how misunderstanding another culture can produce disastrous consequences. Sometimes a war begins not because someone wanted territory or treasure, but because they failed to understand that some objects are valuable for reasons no amount of military power can replace. 22. The War of the Black Flag, when pirates accidentally became diplomat spy. Pirates are usually remembered as reckless outlaws who solved every disagreement with a cannon. Ironically, one of the strangest conflicts involving them began because governments couldn't agree on who was actually a pirate. During the early 1700s, European powers frequently hired privateers, privately owned ships authorized to attack enemy vessels during wartime. The arrangement worked well until peace treaties were signed. Suddenly, thousands of experienced sailors found themselves unemployed, heavily armed, and not particularly interested in honest work. Many simply kept attacking merchant ships. Britain, France, Spain, and other naval powers launched major anti-piracy campaigns throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic, turning former allies into hunted criminals almost overnight. The black pirate flag became the perfect symbol of this strange transition. One year, a captain might be celebrated as a patriotic privateer. The next, he was officially an outlaw with a bounty on his head. The lesson is surprisingly modern. Governments created a workforce with very specialized skills, then seemed shocked when those workers continued using those exact skills after their contracts expired. History proves that giving thousands of people warships and cannons is much easier than convincing them to retire peacefully. 23. The First Opium War. A drug trade ends with a lost empire. Few wars sound stranger than one fought over narcotics, yet the First Opium War fundamentally changed world history. By the early 19th century, Britain was buying enormous amounts of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but had very little China wanted in return. The trade imbalance drained British silver reserves. The solution devised by the British East India Company was brutally simple: sell opium grown in British India to Chinese merchants. The drug spread rapidly despite being illegal in China. Addiction became a national crisis. In 1839, Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of opium at Canton, determined to stop the trade. Britain responded with military force. The resulting war lasted until 1842 and ended with the Treaty of Nanking, forcing China to open treaty ports, pay large indemnities, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. Looking back, it's astonishing that one of history's most important conflicts can be summarized this way. A government tried to stop illegal drugs from entering its country, and another government declared war to protect the business. Sometimes reality writes stories no satirist would dare invent. 24. The War of the Pacific. Taxes on saltpeter changed South America. Forever sometimes wars begin over resources that barely matter today, but once powered the global economy. In the late 19th century, the Atacama Desert contained vast deposits of nitrate, also called saltpeter. It was essential for fertilizer and gunpowder, making it one of the world's most valuable exports before synthetic alternatives existed. Bolivia attempted to impose new taxes on a Chilean-owned mining company operating in disputed territory. Chile argued the taxes violated previous treaties. Negotiations collapsed. In 1879, Chile occupied the port city of Antofagasta. Bolivia declared war, and Peru entered the conflict because of a secret defensive alliance with Bolivia. The War of the Pacific lasted until 1884 and dramatically reshaped South America. Chile emerged victorious, gaining large territories rich in nitrate deposits. Bolivia permanently lost its coastline, becoming the landlocked nation it remains today. It's remarkable how often history repeats itself. One century fights over spices, another fights over bird droppings. Then comes fertilizer minerals. Humanity has always been surprisingly willing to wage enormous wars over whatever happened to be economically priceless at the time. 25. The War of the Button, a tiny fastener. With a very long memory. Not every war earns its name because armies marched across borders. Some become famous because a small object symbolizes generations of rivalry. One famous example comes from 19th century France, where village rivalries sometimes escalated into organized youth battles known as the War of the Buttons. Although popularized by Louis Pergaud's 1912 novel La Guerre des Boutons, the story reflected real traditions in which boys from neighboring villages fought mock battles and collected buttons from defeated opponents as trophies. The buttons themselves weren't valuable. That was precisely the point. Winning meant returning home wearing your enemy's buttons while forcing the losers to explain why their clothes suddenly looked incomplete. For many families, replacing those buttons proved more painful than the bruises. The tale has remained popular because it perfectly captures human competitiveness. Give people a meaningless prize, divide them into teams, and somehow everyone starts behaving as though civilization depends on victory. Thankfully, unlike many entries on this list, these wars usually ended with torn jackets, embarrassed children, and frustrated parents instead of peace treaties signed by exhausted diplomats. 26. The Whiskey Rebellion. America almost went to war with its own farmers. Only a few years after winning independence from Britain, the young United States discovered something awkward. Americans disliked paying taxes just as much when their own government collected them. In 1791, Congress introduced a federal excise tax on distilled spirits to help reduce Revolutionary War debt. For farmers on the western frontier, whiskey wasn't merely a drink. Grain was difficult to transport across mountains, so many converted it into whiskey, which was easier to sell or trade. To them, the new tax felt deeply unfair. Resistance quickly escalated. Tax collectors were threatened, government officials were attacked, and federal authority nearly collapsed across western Pennsylvania. President George Washington made an extraordinary decision. In 1794, he personally led nearly 13,000 militia troops toward the rebellious region, the only sitting U.S. president ever to command troops in the field. The rebellion dissolved before major fighting occurred, and most participants quietly returned home. It's one of the earliest examples of Americans passionately defending what they considered a fundamental right, leaving the government alone with their homemade alcohol. 27. The Emu War. Australia declares battle on birds, and the birds win. No list of ridiculous wars would be complete without history's undisputed heavyweight champion of unintended comedy. In 1932, farmers in Western Australia faced an unexpected agricultural disaster. Around 20,000 emus migrated into farming areas after breeding season, trampling fences and devouring crops already damaged by the Great Depression. The Australian government agreed to help by sending soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns. On paper, the mission sounded straightforward: birds versus trained military personnel. Reality had other plans. The emus scattered into small groups, making them surprisingly difficult targets. Their speed, unpredictable movements, and ability to disappear across rough terrain turned every operation into a frustrating game of feathered hide-and-seek. Machine guns jammed, ambushes failed. At one point, soldiers mounted a gun on a truck, only to discover the vehicle bounced so violently that accurate shooting became impossible. After weeks of effort, relatively few birds had been eliminated compared to the enormous population. The military withdrew, newspapers around the world mocked the operation, and the emus became unlikely folk heroes. Technically, it wasn't a war between nations. But if history ever keeps score, it's difficult to avoid the obvious conclusion. Australia brought machine guns. The emus brought legs. The emus won. History proves one thing: humanity never needed good reasons to start fighting. Which of these absurd conflicts shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable stories that are somehow completely true.